Hi, everybody. So today we have Louis Gov. He was raised in France, as far as I know, and then he went on to study in the United States. And later on, he ended up in Hong Kong, sort of China area, and he's the CEO and founder of GovKal. His company specializes in research, and he has multiple researchers based in China. Um, I'd like Louis Gov to introduce himself for those who don't know, and hopefully, if I have missed anything, you're more than welcome to expand on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Um, the first thing I say, you'll see me scratch my eye a lot. Somehow I picked up an eye infection. I don't know how, and I decided to wear my red shirt so that my eye wouldn't look too bloodshot relative to the shirt. Um, and yeah, so we're GaveKal. We're sort of a hybrid firm. We publish research for institutional investors, and we have about 1,000 institutional investors around the world. And then we also have a money management arm, um, also both based in Hong Kong. We have an office in Beijing, and as you point out, our research is heavily China centric. Um, as is our money management. The bulk of the assets we manage are managed in Chinese fixed income markets. Um, and so, like every fixed income managers, the macro matters a lot, right? Where inflation goes, where growth goes, where policy goes. So yeah, we spend disproportionate amounts of time on this, and um, the past 20 years, or well, we started this a little over 20 years ago now. It's been a very exciting time to cover China. Lots been happening, and I suspect that the next 10 are going to be just as interesting.
Um, so before I go on to asking you about the subject matter, like where your expertise lie, I wanted to ask for some advice you would have for young people because there are so many young people who are now graduating and they've got good grades, they've got extracurriculars, but they're still having a tough time getting a job. So, what advice would you have for a new graduate who's just coming out, who's done a ton of work, but is still having some difficulty finding a role?
Um, I suspect you mean a role in finance, because obviously I know you come from an engineering background, and that's a world that I know fairly little of, at least relative to the financial world. Um, Look, I would say that the financial world right now is it's in massive evolution. Um, the um, you know the money management industry is evolving, the sell side is evolving, um, and it's evolving into directions, I think, where that favor more and more people who come out with scientific degrees, engineers, math degrees, and the like. Um, Everything is becoming more quant based. So if you have that type of profile, I think a lot of firms are looking out for these profiles. When I started finance 25 years or more than that now ago, um, it was probably a more diverse crowd. You had history majors, philosophy majors, and whatever else. Um, so so the first challenge I would say is, what did you study? Um, the second the second big challenge, as I mentioned, is the industry is evolving rapidly. And here, I have my oldest is 18 years old, so not 22, 23 as you highlight, but he'll be there soon enough. And I have this conversation with him all the time, and I keep saying, look, roughly half of my friends from university are today doing jobs that did not exist when we were graduating university. Um, you know, Working for Google, working for Amazon, um, working in private equity, working in venture capital, things that did not. And so chances are, a lot of the 22-year-olds you mentioned graduating today, um, in 20 years' time, they'll be in jobs that don't exist today, and maybe some of them will create those jobs. Um, just like Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook, and so on and so forth. Um, but um, and so you all this to say you have to have a very open mind, uh, a very open mind to the reality that we're in a very very fast changing world, um, and uh, and that within this fast changing world, our industry is evolving very fast. So when I graduated from college, the very best thing you could be was being an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, right? That was the very pinnacle, um, and every kid wanted to be that. Today, the pinnacle is to be a private equity guy. Um, that's as good as it gets. You know, in a world of rising interest rates, maybe being in private equity over the next 10 years is going to prove a lot tougher than people expect. So, where will the opportunities be? Like my own biases. I've spent 25 years in China. My own biases always bring me back to emerging markets. I think that's where a lot of the growth in the world will be. That's where that's where a lot of the exciting things are happening. Um, and I think that bringing capital to emerging markets will be a growth uh, adventure for the next 10, 20 years. So I would say you know that's where I'd advise my kids to go at least.
Interesting. So, and before one last question before we move on to more finance questions, I
Sure.
wanted to ask you, for a lot of people, one they would really like, yes, they look up to people who have founded businesses, etc., and they feel that they've never failed, they've never been through any challenges. So could you go through one or two challenges that you've been through where you really felt like, okay, this is incredibly difficult, or I might fail, or you did fail at something, but you learned from it, you grew from it, and then, everything was fine at the end.
Oh, look, I've failed so many times. And every entrepreneur will tell you that and by the way, my company is a modest success relative to that of others. So I'm not going to like big myself up and say, look, I've created this empire or anything, because that's not the case. We've created a nice small company that is profitable and that, you know, has about 50 employees, um, and I'm very happy with that. And my goal was, to be honest, my objective was never that much more. Um, in fact, when we first started, Charles, Anatole, myself, um, we said, if we ever get to more than 10 employees, then we'll have gone wrong somewhere along the way, because our goal was always to have a small company and not be distracted by things like human resources and spending too much time managing people, etc. But as the business grows, invariably you yeah, you grow with it. Now, um, when we first started, and I think this is the case for any startup, um, the first 3 years were very lean. We had very few clients. We just weren't making that much money. And I was looking at a lot of my friends who'd stayed in banking, because I used to be I used to work for a French investment bank called Paribas, and I left to start this. And I left very early on in my career, and in the next sort of 3 or 4 years, a lot of my friends who'd stayed, their sort of compensation curve went up pretty steeply, and they were making all of a sudden a fair amount of money, and I was making nothing, and I was working twice as hard. And I thought, well, I'm an idiot. I'm working twice as hard, um, and I'm making half the money I used to, and I'm not getting anywhere. And so after about 3 years, to be honest, I was thinking of giving up. I was thinking, okay, this isn't going anywhere. Um, and um, I got a phone call. It was actually a Friday evening, and I got a phone call from um, a gentleman called Bill Miller. Now, I don't know if you know who Bill Miller is, but 20 years ago, he was an absolute legend, because he was an investor who'd outperformed the S&P 500 for 15 years in a row, which was unprecedented. Even Warren Buffett had never done that. Um, and he managed tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars for Legg Mason. So he was I mean, he's still a very big name, by the way. He's still an absolute legend. But 20 years ago, he was as legendary as it gets. And so I get a phone call in the office. This is, sort of 3 years into our business. And I get a phone call in the office, and the lady comes on and says, "Oh, Mr. Gov, would you take a phone call from Bill Miller?" And I thought it was a friend taking the Mickey out of me. Um, and it's like, getting a call from Warren Buffett almost. Um, and so Bill Miller comes on and said, "Well, somebody forwarded me one of your papers, and I thought it was very interesting, and I'd like to ask you some questions about it." Um, and then you said, "Well, do you ever come through Baltimore?" Because he worked for like Mason, Baltimore. And I said, "I can be there next week." Um, and I hopped on a flight and I went there, and Legg Mason became a client. And I thought, you know what? If Bill Miller is going to pay for this, then maybe this is a business after all. Maybe this is going to work. And so this gave me the sort of, which is kind of silly, because whether the money comes from Bill Miller or from somebody else, it's the same money, it's the same amount. uh, but it's the sort of, I was a little, starstruck, and stars in my eyes, and everything else, that it really gave me a boost. Kept going, and then after that we got lucky, to be honest. China really started to take off. We were in the right place in the right time, and that, um, our goal was really to explain China to Western investors, and all of a sudden that was in high demand, and there weren't a lot of people doing that. So there's a lot more now, of course, but back then there weren't that many. So we were in the right place in the right time, and the product took off, um, and so we managed to sort of surf on the China wave. So the I guess the moral of the story is, if you're going to surf a wave, you have first to be in the water, uh, and that wave might take a while to be there, but you might have to sit on your board for a while. But at some point, hopefully a wave comes. If you've identified the right waves, then it's going to be a lot of fun.
Wow, that was an amazing answer. Very, very interesting to hear that. So I just want to transition now to inflation. So everybody's talking about, well, a lot of people are talking about inflation, and there are sort of two schools of thought, um, at least that I've encountered. One is sort of this supply chain disruptions one, and then the other is excess money printing or quantitative easing. So I wanted to ask you your opinion on what do you think is a larger factor? Because there have obviously been lockdowns, etc., but I think that has sort of subsided now. But do you think quantitative easing has played a larger role, or supply chain shocks in the current inflation that a lot of countries are currently facing?
You know the old saying, right? Success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. Um, well, I think when it comes to inflation, is obviously a failure of public policy, um, because you know capitalism is profoundly deflationary. You know, at the end of the day, most entrepreneurs, every CEO wakes up every morning thinking, how do I produce more with less? Less workers, less commodities, uh, less machines, less everything. Everybody's always trying to produce more with less. So this this means that capitalism left alone is a profoundly deflationary force. And so today, um, capitalism is not deflationary. So how did that happen? Well, I think there's many causes, and all of them are linked one way or another to government interference. So yes, the COVID lockdowns created the initial spark to today's inflation problem, but it's hardly the only issue. Um, I think for me, you mentioned the crazy fiscal and crazy monetary policies, and yes, that's a big impact. For the Fed to grow U.S. monetary aggregates by over 20% for 2 consecutive years, and think that there wouldn't be inflation, I don't believe it. To be honest, I think they wanted the inflation. I think there was a level of hubris within the world central banks. If you go back to what they were saying 12, 18 months ago, they were all saying, look, we want inflation because that's how we're going to deal with the debt, etc. What they didn't realize is once inflation is out of the bag, I think they wanted inflation of 3 or 4%. They didn't want it at 8, but inflation is like being pregnant. You start off with a little, and then it grows a lot, and then you have a problem for 18 years. Um, and that's where you are today with um, with inflation. You've basically planted the seed, and it's there. And part of the problem is inflation is a state of mind, just like deflation is. And so it feeds on itself. Inflation is inflationary, um, in that as prices rise, people ask for higher wages, and that makes more prices rise, and it just feeds on itself. And that's where we are now. Now, another to your point, I think there's more than just um, I think there's more than just uh, the dislocation to supply chains or the crazy monetary and fiscal policies. Um, for me, there's another two factors that are still very much with us and that are going to continue weighing on inflation for years to come. The first is that we are in the midst of a massive energy crisis. Um, we're in the midst of a massive energy crisis because of the energy policies we've been following for the past decade. We live in a world where 84% of our energy comes from carbon, whether coal, natural gas, or oil. 84%. Um, and we've basically decided that we need to crush that 84%. We need to crush production in that 84%. We need to restrict it as much as we can, um, while at the same time, basically, so if you look at the other 16%, the other 16% is roughly, ballpark, it's a little more than one third hydro, a little less than one third nuclear, and then the rest being wind and solar. And we've decided, so really we've looked and said, you know what, we're going to constrain the 84% that's carbon. We're not going to grow the 5 or 6% of nuclear. We're not going to grow the 5 or 6% of hydro, and we're only going to grow wind and solar. But that's not going to cut it. That's in the world in which we live in, if you constrain this side and just grow the 2-3% that's wind and solar, it's doesn't square the circle. So we are in the midst of an energy crisis to which there's no obvious short-term solution aside from discarding all the environmental rules we've placed on ourselves, which comes with it then its own costs, long-term damage to the environment, etc. But let's not kid ourselves that we're we're, there's easy solutions there. Then there's a fourth element, which is deglobalization. The period 1995 to really 2018 was a period of accelerating globalization, right? People were talking about Chin America, the union of the two big economic blocs, and global supply chains and gains of efficiency and massive productivity gains thanks to offshoring and outsourcing. Um, all that is over. We now live in a deglobalizing world where instead of trying to figure out how to optimize your chain of production, most policymakers are now trying to weaponize their comparative advantage to trip up the next guy. So the US weaponizes the semiconductor industry to trip up China. Europe weaponizes its financial industry to block Russia. Russia weaponizes its energy industry to implode Europe. Everybody's trying to implode the next guy. So we're instead of looking for productivity gains, we're look everywhere you care to look. You're seeing productivity destruction. Now, lower productivity inherently means higher inflation. So, sorry for the long-winded answer to your question, but unfortunately, there's many causes for today's surge in inflation, and you know it, if you assume like me that inflation is inflationary, it means that we now have a structurally very different global macroeconomic and financial environment.
Interesting. And so there are many people who say that gold or cryptos are a hedge against inflation. But um, if we look at the prices of gold and cryptos, they don't seem to be increasing at 8 or 10% annually, or matching the percentage of annual inflation. So, what are your opinions on inflation hedging assets, and what do you think? Uh, could you and what do you think some of those are?
Yeah, no, lately gold and crypto have been more hedges against capital gains than anything. Um, the Look, I think the genuine hedge against inflation is energy, because that's the core problem we have today. Um, and in that respect, if like me, you believe that we've underinvested in energy for the past 5 years, and that the coming years are going to be complicated on both the economic front the um, um, and the inflation front because of this lack of energy, that in essence, the great powers are going to have to compete with each other to get access to restricted energy supplies. Um, then crypto's got a problem and it's got a problem because um, it's quite energy intensive, right? Crypto boomed. The 10-year crypto boom came at a time when energy prices were low, and when liquidity was plentiful, when central banks were printing money, and crypto was sort of a receptacle for all this excess liquidity being printed. And crypto was consuming lots of energy, but who cared? It was very cheap. Well, the two pillars on which crypto was built are shaking violently right now. The central banks are withdrawing liquidity, and energy prices are going up. So those are two big hurdles. When it comes to gold, I've always thought, and I've written this many times, that gold's actually it's actually a play on emerging markets more than anything. Because if you look at physical demand for gold, the physical demand for gold in the world, roughly a third comes from the Indian subcontinent. Roughly a third comes from China. Another 20% or so comes from the broader Middle East. So you look at gold, physical demand for gold, and it's basically almost all emerging markets. So when emerging markets do well, gold does well, and when emerging markets do badly, gold does badly. Now, today there's a lot of emerging markets struggling, right? We've seen, Sri Lanka completely implode. There's riots in Pakistan and massive floods in Pakistan. Egypt is struggling. Um, Argentina's imploding. Like everywhere you care to look, a lot of emerging markets are, they're hurting, and the Indian rupees just gapped down, and the renminbi has broken over 7. So you look at all these things and all the parameters that would um, lead you to think, okay, gold's got to be struggling. Um, it's happening. Right now, if you might think gold isn't doing that great, but of course, if you're uh, a Pakistani investor, then gold is held up very well for you, because the you can now sell your gold for more Pakistani rupees than you ever could. Um, by the same token, if you're again a Pakistani investor, all of a sudden buying gold becomes more complicated in terms of Pakistani rupees. It's much more expensive. Um, so um, so for me, those the natural hedges to the and I've argued this in many pieces over the past couple of years, and the natural hedge, and in my book that I wrote last year called Avoiding the Punch. Sorry to plug my book, but I kind of have to. Um, the um, um, the natural hedge is in gold or or bitcoins. The natural hedge to inflation is energy. Um, that's what you need today.
Very interesting. Um, so I'd like to now move on to ask a bit more about the so there are many geopolitical challenges, as you've mentioned, right? Like there's the war in Ukraine, there are tensions rising between the United States and China, and I was sort of the view. I tend not to give my views, but I will though this time, that over sanctioning Russia could lead to Putin doing what he's doing now, which is saying I'm not going to send any gas. So, in terms of that, do you what are the impacts of sort of the sanctions and then the counter sanctions, etc., on the economy of the EU and United Kingdom?
Look, I think there's it's a great question, and there's many ways to look at this. Um, the invasion of Ukraine definitely warranted a response from the Western world. Um, Now, I'm not in the job of telling policymakers what they should do, right? I'm in the job of looking at what policymakers are doing and trying to see how that's going to impact markets. Um, there's no money in telling policymakers what they should do, right? Um, I mean, unless they want to pay you for it, but they don't. Um, so that, you can leave that to the editorial board of the New York Times or the Economist or whatever else. Where there's money to be made is, again, analyzing what they are doing and figuring out what that means for market. So yes, to your point, I think it was always pretty obvious that once the Western world had decided to weaponize their financial system against Russia, Russia had to respond, and the only thing really Russia could do uh, was weaponize its energy industry. That was really the only potential response, and that's happened, um, and could get worse from here. We could get into this winter. If you're Putin and you think Europe is on the ropes, this winter, not only did you completely stop the gas, but you probably bombed the hell out of Ukraine's power infrastructure, which you haven't done yet, and you basically cut out the electricity for the whole of Ukraine, while at the same time stopping all oil exports, or at least stopping all oil exports to Europe. And in so doing, you create a massive squeeze. I'm not saying that's what he will do, but the odds of that are non-negligible. And if he does, you get to oil at $150 really, really quickly. Um, so so that's and again, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but investing is all about looking at the realms of possibilities and figuring out how your portfolio does depending on different scenarios. um, so that's number one. I would also say that um, in the European response, um, the 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 weaponization of the financial system against the Russian state was one thing. Like taking the central bank reserves of Russia was one thing. I think the other, where we said, okay, we're going to take the assets of all the oligarchs. We're going to take, Roman Abramovich's football club. We're going to take their yachts. We're going to take their private jets. We're going to take their houses. To be honest, I think that was a massive policy mistake on our front. And I think it's a massive policy mistake because if you look at the Western world, one of our greatest comparative advantages historically, or at least in recent decades, is property rights and the rule of law. The reality is, you can be black, brown, yellow, white. You can be Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Christian. If you go in front of a court of law in London, in Paris, in New York, you have the same rights as the next guy, right? Everybody has the same rights. Everybody's equal before the law. And now we've added a little asterisk to this that says, except if you're Russian. If you're Russian, we can take all your stuff. We can take all your stuff without a debate in parliament. We can take all your stuff without a court order. Simply, the prime minister or the president wakes up one morning and decides, you know what, these Russian guys are bad news, so I'm going to take all the properties of every Russian, um, and that'll be that. Um, this is now, imagine if you're a Saudi prince or a Chinese tycoon or a Qatari emir, and you see this. You think, well, hold on. If tomorrow MBS decides to kill another journalist in one of his consulates, does that mean I lose my house in London? Um, if you're a Chinese tycoon, you think, well, hold on. If tomorrow um, the Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan, something I have no visibility and no influence over, does that mean I lose my house in Vancouver? Well, I bought that house in Vancouver for that very purpose. I was getting money out of my own country, whether China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Brunei, Bahrain, you name it, because I don't fully trust my ruler, because I don't fully trust my political system, because I trust the legal framework of the Western world. But now, if that legal framework of this Western world only protects me if they still like my ruler, then that legal framework really isn't that useful for me. Um, so I think we've basically undermined our one big comparative advantage. Um, so right now you got to think that money's flowing into Saudi Arabia, right? Money's flowing into Dubai, money's flowing into Bahrain, Brunei, Qatar, with the prices of energy where they are. And historically, a lot of that money would have just round tripped. It would have come back and it would have bought London houses. It would have bought, it would have gone into Zurich bank accounts. Maybe it would have bought some football clubs in London. Um, and that money would have round tripped. Um, but now it's not. I think it's staying in the Middle East, contributing to the US dollar squeeze we're seeing. Um, because historically, Europeans buy dollars to buy oil. Saudi gets the money, then Saudi sells the dollars to buy assets in Europe. Um, but now that latter part isn't happening because, again, if you're a Saudi prince, how convinced are you that in a crisis you get to keep your assets in Europe? So I think that was a big mistake on our part, on our policymakers' part.
And you've previously also talked about how it can impact potentially the Swiss franc. But I don't, I'm not certain. But has there been a major impact on the Swiss franc? Because you said that this policy implication of sanctioning Russian individuals could lead to the Swiss doing that. Was
Yeah, no,
very
like
unprecedented.
yeah,
But
I think
but
historically, you would have seen a lot of, again, your Saudi prince making all of a sudden more money would have, that money would have round tripped into Zurich bank accounts. I'm not sure it's doing that now. Now, granted, the Swiss franc is in the worst European currency right now. I think the sterling is, um, and the euro isn't so hot either. Um, but and I think the Swiss franc is doing very well against the euro. Um, but the Swiss franc, look, I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole of the Swiss franc if you want, but it's an interesting one because the Swiss franc is a very different animal from what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the Swiss National Bank basically held a bunch of gold and that was that. Um, in the past 10 years, the Swiss National Bank has become um, far more active in global equity markets, right? It's gone out and as to prevent the Swiss franc from going up, it was always intervening all the time, and with all the basically US dollars and euros it was accumulating, it turned around and bought, because there was no point in buying bonds, it went out and bought massive amounts of long dated equities, and just bought Apple and basically large cap equities, so that the balance sheet of the Swiss National Bank is now much more uh, volatile because of this equity exposure than it would have been in the past. Having said this, maybe it's just as well it didn't buy long bonds, because long bonds have actually fallen more than equities. Um, but so yeah, there's a lot to be said about the Swiss franc, and it'll be interesting to see how it does in this current market down cycle.
interesting. So in terms of the sort of implications of the financial implications. So if there were, uh, as you said, you do analysis of when uh, different situations may or may not happen. But what would the financial implications be for China if they were to, let's say, they were to go in and invade Taiwan? Financially, in terms of if there were sanctions, heavy sanctions, etc., could China weather something like Russia has weathered? Or what would sort of the implications be for people across the globe, financially, money-wise, food-wise, supply chains, etc.?
That's a lot of ifs. So first, is China? Let's break it down because it's a too big a piece to swallow all at once. So let's break it down. First, is China going to invade Taiwan? I really don't think so. Um, it's look, we're seeing all the difficulties that Russia's having in invading Ukraine, right? And that's invading over planes. The Russian tanks can just roll in. Um, it has part of the population that supports it. Um, if China invading Taiwan, you're talking about an amphibious operation over 100 miles of water. Um, the German army, back when it was, the juggernaut that it was in 1940, 1941, when it had conquered the whole of Europe, never even attempted to cross the British Channel, and that was just 6 miles. Here we're talking about 100 miles um, of a sea that's often quite rough, actually. Then you basically have three beaches on which you can land that are big enough to do any kind of landing in Taiwan. So you can probably expect those to be decently defended. And by the way, there's the U.S. fleet in the middle, just in case you were wondering. And then you're invading an island that's very, very mountainous. And of course, invading mountainous regions is always the hardest, right? Because it's hard to move tanks, it's hard to move artillery. Um, People forget, but Taiwan is basically mountains that fall into the sea. There's peaks that are 12,000 feet in Taiwan. So, the logistic, just the logistic element, and you're doing this, you would want to do this with an army that has not a single person that has ever fought a war, because the Chinese army hasn't done anything since the mid 70s against Vietnam. Um, so you have a completely untested army, untested soldiers, untested navy, untested air force, because China's navy and air force is only about 10 years old. Um, to me, that seems like madness. And it seems like, so first, is it going to happen? No, it's not going to happen. Now, the reason it's not going to happen is there's a much cheaper way for China to invade Taiwan, and that's just to just buy it, um, to just buy all the various assets it wants in Taiwan, and that's really what's happening. Today China's going around and hiring all the best engineers out of TSMC, hiring all the best engineers out of UMC, and sure, they're paying them 2 or 3 times the price that TSMC might be paying them, but that's still cheaper than invading. And it's also a bigger guarantee of obtaining really what you want. If you invade Taiwan, supposedly to get TSMC and UMC, those companies are destroyed. The engineers are on a plane to the US or to Japan, and that's that. And you have a hole in the ground. So there's no real reason to think, I think, that Taiwan's going to invade China. That China's going to invade Taiwan. Sorry. Um, I don't think it's going to happen. Now, if it did happen, um, this is where it gets interesting: is what kind of sanctions will the rest of the world impose? Now, arguably, Taiwan's a very different situation than Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine was a sovereign nation with, everybody's got ambassadors with Ukraine, and everybody Ukraine has a seat at the United Nations, and so on, and it was recognized. It was even recognized by Russia. Russia had an ambassador in Ukraine. Um, it's uh, Taiwan. Everybody has accepted. Pretty much everybody's accepted China's rhetoric that it is a renegade region, right? So, you know, when there's troubles in New Caledonia, France can send troops down there and nobody complains. It's French sovereign territory. Um, so, at the UN, it'd be a tough one, right? It's like it'd be fairly unprecedented. Legally speaking, how do you what do you do? And then we get to your question: is um, when it came to Russia, I think the U.S. didn't care about sanctioning Russia because the U.S. does very little trade with Russia. The U.S. exports about as much to Russia as Belgium exports to Russia. So it was really peanuts for the U.S. Now, if something bad happened with Taiwan, you could bet that the lobbying from big US companies, Walmart, Apple, General Motors, all these companies for whom Coca-Cola, for whom China is now a massive market, and where they've made massive investments. A lot of these companies would probably say, okay, well, we need to do something, but let's just give it a slap on the wrist, because, economically speaking, China is much, much more important, and Taiwan really isn't. Um, so yeah, so long story short, sorry to be so long-winded, but I don't believe that it'd be um, uh, I don't believe it's going to happen. And if it did happen, I think the big economic impact would be that the whole global semiconductor supply chain would just implode, because TSMC would go off grid, UMC would go off grid. So if you believe it's going to happen, again, I don't, but if you believe it's going to happen, you should be loading up on Samsung Electronic and SK Hynix, because if TSMC is off grid, basically these guys own the market.
Oh yeah, so basically your financial hedge would be buying Samsung and the other company you just mentioned.
SK
Okay.
Hynix. Yep. Yep.
Okay, well, very, very interesting.
But again, I don't believe it's going to
Oh yeah,
happen,
yeah,
so
okay.
don't rush out and buy them.
I have no idea. I have no idea. Um, that's why, but interesting. Um, so now I'd like to transition to some questions about a sort of social inequality. So you see, technology companies seem to be taking over, right? I mean, the technology sector is booming. People are getting hired left, right, center. Their salaries are increasing, etc. But at the same time, um, other wages seem to be very, very stagnant. And so you have sort of a wealth gap within the middle class now between sort of the upper middle and middle class with the lower middle class, and then obviously the super wealthy and the non-super wealthy. So that is now causing some social anxiety. What do you think is a way for societies to sort of tackle this wealth gap, or how can of course, a lot of capitalists don't, for example, believe in equal outcome, but still, what are there some ways that policymakers could potentially make lives easier for the average Joe who are facing a lot of problems with inflation, etc.?
Like I tend to believe that I'll tell you a story. The Louis Louis the 14th, it was sort of the very, very beginning of industrialization, at the very start of industrialization. Um, the very sort of first signs of industrialization was the textile industry around Lyon in France. And Louis the 14th was came to visit you know, these new sort of textile factories where you had young women working on mills, um, and uh, and he said, "Oh, this is fascinating. This is fabulous. You know, what should I do to help? You know, because every government, when they see something that's good, they want to like latch onto it. And the factory owner said, "Sir, please don't do anything. Uh, surtout ne faites rien. Please don't do anything. We'll be fine. We'll be fine on our own." And so, again, I'm not in the business of telling governments what they should do. Um, I think they've done quite enough in recent years. Thank you very much. Um, they've been hubristic enough in thinking that by pulling this lever and pushing on this button and etc., they can they can make things better. I think, if they hadn't meddled in the way they have, we probably wouldn't have the 8.5% inflation, and frankly, we wouldn't have the massive wealth inequality that you highlight. That the primary reason for the wealth inequality of recent years is what's called the Cantillon effect. After actually, he sounds French, but he was actually Irish, Richard Cantillon, uh, who explained all the way back in the 17th century, that when a central bank prints money, it's whoever's closest to the printing, gets the most, and whoever's furthest away, basically at the end of the day, suffers the negative consequences. And that's what we've seen. So when you look at today's crazy wealth inequality, it's very much linked to you know the quantitative easing policies we followed, the excess money printing, the um, which have led to um, private equity guys piling on leverage and making fortunes mostly through leverage. Um, it has led to real estate guys, massive re-rating of real estate, etc. Um, and if nothing else, it's really the real estate that's contributed to the wealth inequality, because all of a sudden young people can't afford real estate anywhere. Um, The good news is, we're rolling back the clock on all these crazy policies. QE is over. Negative interest rate policies are over. So now this whole cantillon effect is working into reverse. And, and now what you're finding is actually, 10 years ago, if you were a hardworking plumber, you were underpaid and couldn't afford to live in a city. Well, that's changing now, right? So a lot of the, I would say, the working class, your plumbers, your electricians, uh, all of a sudden, they're starting to get paid a lot better. Um, and so, um, no, look, the to be honest, the whole the wealth effect, the wealth disparity, it's all because of the tech guys. Um, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. For me, it's all because of the QE. It's all because of the crazy money printing. Sure, like the parabolic rise in the share prices of Amazon, Microsoft, etc. That's a consequence of the money printing. Um, and as a result, yes, you do get wealth inequality. Um, but let's not blame Microsoft and let's not blame Amazon for wealth disparity because it's not their fault. The fault is the policymakers who've done quite enough. Thank you very much. And if they just stop doing the crazy policies, and they are stopping, um, then I think that will over time deal with it. But let's not kid ourselves that the trajectory from where we've been to where we're going is going to be a pleasant one.
Very interesting. And um, so I'd like to ask you about whether you think religion has a role to play in the 21st century. Do you think because of the social anxiety, people obviously want to deal with us. Do you think spirituality or religion can help people, or it's just fairy tales and just has nothing to do with helping people sort of deal with problems or calming themselves or anything?
Well, I look. I think that that answer can only be personal, right? So I'll just give you my own personal answer. But what works for me doesn't mean it works for you. It doesn't mean it works for somebody else. Um, yes, so personally, I am Catholic. I like to go to mass every Sunday, and it is a big part of my life, and it works very well for me. It it grounds me. It brings a sense of perspective. It brings me peace in troubled times. Um, so it works very well for me. But again, everybody's different. That's what makes life interesting. If we were all the same, it'd be very boring. Um, Now, what I would say would be an ant colony. So it works for me, but what works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you or for the next guy. Um, what I would say, however, as a society, I can't remember who said it, but this famous quote: when people stop believing in God, it doesn't mean they believe in nothing. It means they believe in anything. Um, and I think we've seen a lot of that in the past few years. The for me the whole panic around COVID, which was a disease that at the end of the day really wasn't that deadly. Um, and the whole panic around the idea that all of a sudden 95-year-olds might die from catching a really bad flu. um, it to me it is the sort of a symptom of a post religious society, um, that all of a sudden, death, instead of being embraced as part of life, um, we're now moving into society where death is something to be, you know that that we just can't accept anymore. um, and if you live your life, where you think, okay, I can't accept death, um, it's well, it's a life that's bound to failure, right? Because you are going to die, and the people you love are going to die, and that's, I mean, we may bemoan it, etc., but it's reality. You just have to learn to accept it and live with it. Um, and it seems that I think as a society we've sort of twisted ourselves into knots to believe that death is actually a failure. um, and from there, you get the crazy policies we've seen in recent years. Crazy policies that are having consequences. To save the 95-year-olds during COVID, we imposed untold harm on all of our children. Preventing them from school, preventing them from socializing. Um, Things that will have long-term lasting consequences, psychological consequences. It's not normal for teenagers to be stuck in apartments in cities for months on end with nobody to see but their parents. That's teenagers, and I say this as a parent of teenagers. I've got 4 teenagers. um, it's they're meant to be out and running behind a ball, or you know talking to girls if they're boys, or boys if they're girls, and um, meant to be out there living their lives. So I think the fact that we've increasingly moved to being post-religious societies, uh, it has an impact on policy making, and that impact is not a positive one.
That is very interesting. Um, so, before I ask you my last question, I'd like to ask you. So, there's some, as always, you don't have to answer. This is that part of this section here. So, but yeah, there's some. There's a lot of controversy around social media, right? And there have been social media bans. And so some people believe that platforms should have the right to determine who and who cannot be banned on their platform if they do not follow the terms of service. Others believe it hampers free speech. What is your view on this? And as always, you don't have to answer
No,
because, yeah, okay, yeah, it's fine.
I don't mind.
Yeah,
Like, I'm a free speech absolutist. Um, I believe, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Um, if you want to say horrible things about me, have at it. I don't care. Um, and so, well, of course I care, but I'd rather you have the right to say them than not say them. Um, and it's so personally speaking. Um, I used to have a Twitter account, and I used to tweet, and I used to post, etc. And when Twitter went down the rabbit hole of blocking people for their free speech, I backed away. I said, all right, you know what? I'm not going to use this. Um, I've just canceled my PayPal account because PayPal, I don't know if you saw, but decided to block the Free Speech Union's PayPal account. They've decided to block a bunch of various um, accounts in the U.S., such as Gays Against Groomers, and um, so uh, all this to say that um, when you look at platforms who diverge from their mission statement, who told you I'll be one thing, i.e., Facebook, Twitter, and end up doing something else, then just walk away. Say, okay, why am I going to give you my free content um, when you're promoting a vision that I don't agree with? So I think that um, for me, Twitter, Facebook, these companies that have veered away from their initial goals, um, they're in permanent decline. And their share prices, since basically, look at the share price of Twitter, look at the share price of Facebook. These are not growth stories anymore. They're not. Um, they're not because you know go woke, go broke. um, and that's what's happened to them. You don't want to be free speech, fine. I don't want to use you anymore.
very interesting. And last but not least, I'd like to end on this with this question. So, what do you think is the purpose of life? And I'd love to hear what you think it is. Yeah.
Still trying to figure it out. um, the Look, the purpose of life. So like I told you, I'm Catholic, and I believe that that for me the most uh, powerful parable of Christ is the talent parable. Um, so, the talent parable, Christ tells this story of a master who gives uh, 10 coin to the servant he likes the most, and then 5 coin to the servant he also likes, and then 1 coin to the servant who he thinks isn't very good. And the servant who is not very good buries the talent because he's worried of losing it. The one who's got 5 lends it out for interest, the um, and the guy who's given the 10 talents goes out, creates a business that's flourishing, etc. And when the master comes back after a long trip, he asks his his um, servants, what did you do with the money I gave you? And the first one said, well, look, I created this business, so I turned your 10 into 20, and here's your 20. And this master says, keep the 20. And then the next guy says, well, look, I loaned it out for interest, so here's your 5 plus 1. And he says, okay, you can keep the plus 1 and I'll keep the 5. And then the last one says, I buried it in the ground because I was afraid to lose it. And he's he's cast out and fired. Um, and the message is, I think if you've been given a lot, then you're going to be, when the time comes to settle accounts with God, he's going to ask for a lot back. Now, I think I've been blessed to be given a lot. And so to answer your question, what's the meaning of life? When you've been given a lot of talents, you have to make the most with them. Um, and whatever talent you have, you can't go and bury it under a tree. Um, and so, talent is dual meaning, right? Because it's both a measure of silver and a measure of course, what you have. So, the purpose of life, I think, is to find out first what your talent is. Uh, Find out what you're good at, and then once you do that, to make sure you make the world a better place and you make the world prosper through your talent. And only then will you um, will you be able to present yourself at the final hour with your head held up high.
Wow, that was a beautiful answer. Honestly, I really loved that
Uh,
entire
uh,
story about Jesus. So yeah, that was just amazing.
uh,
But thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Rudolph. It was honestly a pleasure to have you on, and I'd love to have you back one day, hopefully. And
Sure.
if you're ever in
My
London,
pleasure.
just ping me. That
Will
would
do.
be great.
Will do.
Thank
Thanks a bunch. Good luck.
you.